Kate Milifalcho, welcome to Irish Granny Helen. It's time for our Saturday book, and this weekend we're continuing with our book from last week, Jesus and the Lost Goddess. This is video number 3. This is The Secret Teachings of the Original Christians by Timothy Freke and Peter Gandy. This is actually an in-depth, really pretty sophisticated discussion of Gnosticism, and large portions of it were new to me. I found it really, really interesting, and I love the way that they explain symbolism that's multi-layered in so many stories, biblical and otherwise, that are really part of our culture, and they go very far back into other cultures that you wouldn't necessarily have guessed. And it's just fascinating what the symbols mean, and the, like I said, the sophistication of the ideas that they're trying to get across in a way that's palatable for people who really aren't interested in digging into the deeper meaning. They're just enjoying the story, but there's so much more. And before I even start, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I think the best way to look at all of this is, first of all, we're not denigrating any particular belief system. We're simply presenting something older and maybe not well known. Second of all, any critique that does happen is based on historical fact. Third, I think the easiest way to approach all of this is to look at Aesop's fables, stories from the ancient past, on the surface, lighthearted. Even little kids can get the basic point. And there's a simple moral of the story that, it's pretty clear to anybody who reads it. And yet as an adult, you realize, well, now we're not going to take this literally. The fox and the tortoise, or the fox and the grapes, or whatever, they're not literally speaking. This is, after all, symbolic. It's a fable. And underneath, as adults, we usually understand the layered message. So that's kind of what we have to keep in mind going into this book. And I'm worried that it requires a willingness to maintain an open mind, even when closely held ideas are challenged. And I invite you to stick with it and just listen and digest it later. I found it very interesting. And just to add caveat upon caveat, I'm coming from a place of, I didn't write the book, that's the first thing. And they leaned very heavily on the work of archaeologists and historians and biblical scholars and other scriptural scholars and linguists. This much of the book is notes, sources, directly to the source. So anything that's in this book is based on something that can be verified in the three-dimensional world. It's not just opinion. We interrupt the narrative quite a bit to give sources, quotes from the ancients, Plotinus, Plato, guys like that. And just also one last thing, this is not full of my opinions, and that's why I picked the book. Actually, the truth is I almost didn't read this book. I have a what would I call it, like a knee-jerk reaction against getting all up into Jesus. I mean, the story of Jesus, he's a good guy, has a lot of good things to say. I take any belief system with a block of salt. That's just me. So drag my feet a little bit. I've had this on my bookshelf for a couple of years and have just sort of looked past it. I don't know why I got it. I can't remember if somebody gave it to me or somebody bought it for me, or if I bought it myself on a recommendation. And when I got it, I thought, oh. I think you are presented with things by the cosmos when you're ready for them. And I'm a little bit more mellowed out and open-minded than I was in my younger days. There was a time when I would have resisted anything with the name Jesus in it because I was resisting the personal experiences of the past. And I'm more open-minded to listening now, and I'm really glad I did, because this challenges, that's one of my favorite words, it challenges preconceived notions that are just ubiquitous in our culture. And yet it takes those ideas and expounds on them in a way that's really remarkable. So that's me done preaching. I'm going to get off the pulpit now and we'll cover the book. And we are on chapter 3, the Church of the Antichrist. Don't run away. It's okay. Let's see here. So this chapter begins with this quotation. That which is called the Christian religion existed among the ancients and never did not exist from the beginnings of the human race until Christ came in the flesh, at which time the true religion, which already existed, began to be called Christianity. This is from Augustine's Retractions. Now, I'm going to move beyond that quotation later, but that presents an interesting thing to think about. There's a history, in history, there's a pattern of Gnostics. They are pretty much all dissidents, nonconformists. They're resistant to being told what to believe. They like to go on that journey on their own. And unwittingly, because of that sense of independence and free thinking, they inspire authoritative literalists and the religions that go with them. Religion started with, usually, this is the pattern, a charismatic master who shares personal understanding. And for Gnosticism, it's no different. There are masters, so described by other people, referred to by other people as masters, who know a lot or seem to understand a lot. Gnosis is wisdom. And they usually attract other people who are interested in the concepts, forms a small group. And lo and behold, for Gnosticism, and it doesn't matter what brand, Jewish, pagan, Christian, they share a common core set of beliefs called the perennial philosophy, and describe it in their own vocabulary, in their own way, in their own context, and yet continue to agree. Gnostics usually agree on this core, which we're going to talk about. The group grows, and pretty soon there are too many people in the group to actually have a one-on-one personal relationship with the teacher, the master. And what inevitably happens, historically, we see this repeat itself. Authoritarians slowly take over because, they have to organize and they're really into hierarchies. And the next thing you know, you've got something entirely different than what began. And it's basically a new religion. And important, I think, to remember that the word religion comes from the Latin to relinquare, which means to be tied up. Well, no matter how you pronounce it, it means to be tied up. I think that's really interesting. So as the student and master ratio becomes unbalanced, the level of understanding of the real core concepts decreases. It's a one-on-one tutoring situation is always better than being in a class of 500 people. You get more personal attention. Subtle allegories are taken as superficial and literal eventually with the passage of time, and inevitably they degenerate from sophisticated Gnostic ideas to shallow, convoluted literalism. And this is not a negative critique. It is, but it's not intended as that directly. It's intended to say that there's this movement away from something that's subtle and many layered, nuanced, and sophisticated. And inevitably, it becomes surface and superficial, and it loses some connection to the real meaning. And this is what happened to Christianity. Now, this is the part where people start to resist and don't want to hear this. It's very hard to hear a criticism of your belief system, but this is the history of what really happened. And there's a lot of archaeological, scriptural, and historical evidence that this is what happened. So open minds. Let's just continue to have open minds. So as the Jesus myth was given an historical context in the last chapter, we talked about that. This story was taken, and it came from many sources in the far distant past, was amalgamated, synthesized into this story, this bare bones story of Jesus, and was created into an historical figure. And it became inevitable that it would be thought to be a record of real events, and that was never the intention. You can see the story repeated in the past, different names, different countries, different languages, but it's the same story. And it's not them predicting what's going to happen in the future. It's them talking about a belief system. By the mid-200s, not CE, I'm old, I think AD. Literalists and literalist Christianity was beginning to dominate in Rome with autocrats, like a guy called Irenaeus. And he was sort of one of the earliest theologians, I guess. I'm not sure that's exactly the right name. Right term of the very early Christian church, but he went in the direction of taking everything literally. So in the Gnostic belief system, the story is really an initiation allegory about achieving truth or Gnosticism, gnosis, knowledge, wisdom of what the truth is. And this got replaced by a liberalist salvation story and a belief in an actual physical historical Messiah. The literalists reorganized the similarities to the pagan god Osiris, that story. And they could claim the myth of the dying and resurrected God-man in real life if they could apply it to this Jesus figure that was created. They began as a small sect with, as this book puts it, a macabre enthusiasm for the imminent end of the world. That really hasn't changed a whole lot. The absolute obsession with Armageddon and the apocalypse and the second coming of Christ and all of this stuff is predicated on an anxiety and anticipation of the end of the world. The Gnostics said that Jesus would appear at the culmination of time, and this is an allegory. What they really meant was when all souls would be reunited with the consciousness of God, there would be a return to the primordial state of oneness, and the cosmic drama would be over. So just to very briefly summarize what they believed, we come forward from the source, the God source, which we'll talk about later in the book. For now, we're just going to use the terms without really defining them, but it's the God source, the divine. We are all a part of that, and we are sent out into incarnation. We become into our bodies to experience. And when the body's done, the soul is infinite. I'm using the word soul in a generic way. The divine part of you is infinite, and it returns to the divine. It can reincarnate or move on. It's, that's getting a little too far ahead of ourselves. Where am I? Augustine, who I quoted at the beginning, was a great Christian literalist spokesman, and he claimed that Christ actually was a real life person who came in the flesh. And so this began as a small sect. They were really obsessed with death. The Gnostics said that Jesus would appear at the culmination of time as an allegory. And once everyone achieved a state of gnosis and understood our oneness with consciousness or the source, then this drama would be over, and then something else. Literalists took this allegory literally and said that Jesus would soon arrive to destroy the world, rescue a small elite group of Christian literalists, and condemn everyone else to eternal torture. That in a nutshell. They replaced the mythical sacrifice God-man with an historical martyr, and became basically a self-ending, I don't want to use the S word on YouTube, but a cult of self-ending. And they encourage members to imitate Jesus by seeking a sacrificial death. There's all sorts of historical resource that tells of their embracing of the notion of being a martyr. They would seek it out. They saw the Roman authorities as singling out Christians for terrible persecution, and the literalists' eagerness to be martyred horrified the Gnostics. We've read about this before. They were, the Gnostics were like, what is wrong with you? Why are you risking your neck for this? The literalists replaced the Gnostic initiates and the Gnostic sage. They replaced that with the hierarchy of bishops at the head of an evangelical cult. The Gnostics hoped to bring the initiates to spiritual maturity, free of external authority, to be their own king. And I've talked about that before. I'll talk about it again. There's a simple little phrase that they use. You need to be your own monarch. So you're internally, within yourself, the master of your domain. You're the that's a little Seinfeld joke. You're in charge of your own choices and your spiritual journey. And externally, we would prefer, I don't know how to say this without getting in trouble, philosophical anarchy. In other words, no belief system or religious theocratic authority will tell you what you should or should not believe, because you're your own monarch. So you're an internal monarch and an external anarchist. And we're not speaking politically. I'm not advocating anything like that. This is a philosophical discussion, YouTube. Literalists wanted a large religious power base with a flock under tight control. Sheep all follow each other, just keep that in mind. The Gnostics' belief that each would become a Christ was called heresy. And if you haven't heard the first two videos, Christ means the anointed one. Anybody is a Christ. Anybody who comes from the divine and achieves gnosis, wisdom of consciousness, is an anointed one, a Christ. And this was just horrified early church fathers. Gnostic masters got initiates to confront the mysteries of life. to dig a little deeper and to try to understand the purpose, what we are, the nature of life, and the purpose of life. Literalist bishops told their followers what to believe, and they disciplined any disagreement. There was no such thing as a free intellectual inquiry. They demanded blind belief. Now we're talking about the early church, not the original Gnostic Christian church that came before, but what evolved from that a couple of hundred years later under the auspices of the Roman Empire. Blind belief, if the Jesus myth was a literal biography, then they had this intolerance for anything other than belief in that, and their dogma, it became inevitable that they would have strictures and boundaries and control. If the story of Jesus was about an historical man, all arguments end in one idea being correct and every other person being wrong. There was no room for personal growth. Many Christian scriptures were cherry-picked. So what is the Bible is a collection in the New Testament. The Old Testament is old Jewish, I think the first 5 books of the Pentateuch, the Torah, and a lot of stories. And many of the stories are taken from Jewish Gnosticism, but we don't know that yet. And then the New Testament is 4 Gospels that were cherry-picked out of a whole lot more. A lot of stuff was destroyed. Fortunately for us, some of it was hidden and rescued. The Gnostic Gospels. And what was saved, for example, the letters of St. Paul, were rewritten and falsified, said the opposite of what he really believed. And some of his original work was rescued and found. And there's proof now. And this is not just opinion. There is historical evidence to this now that archaeologists, scriptural scholars, and historians do agree on. And it is, if you really feel like you need visual proof, it's all in here. And I'm not going to read like 50 pages of resource notes, but they're worth looking into if you want to inquire beyond what we're talking about here. So they assembled these, and they're assembled in a way that would lead you to believe that these were 4 different people who had 4 slightly different perspectives of an actual historical event, but they were preceded by many other more popular texts, and these 4 were not standard for a couple of hundred years, and they did not, these are not eyewitness accounts. Literalists, bishops, they created a false narrative to connect themselves to the fictional disciples of the Gospels. Paul was really the great messenger of Christian Gnosticism, and I have to admit that I participated in criticism of him, not knowing this, and I find it very interesting. I've been looking some of this stuff up on the internet, and the accepted conventional definitions and explanations of a lot of this stuff operate on a premise that very obviously comes from the early Roman church, which is secondary to Gnosticism, because the first thing almost everything says is Gnosticism was a form of heresy. Okay, that should be your red flag. So Paul, the great messenger of Christian Gnosticism, was turned into an anti-Gnostic by forged letters, and only in the last couple of centuries have archaeologists and religious scholars realized this. Literalists co-opted the work of numerous Gnostics who promoted a philosophy about the Logos and Sophia, which we'll get into. They weren't even very interested in Jesus. And in fact, some of the Gnostics, very influential Gnostics, they never talked about Jesus per se. So you've got somebody, for example, Minucius Felix, who was asked to name somebody who arose from the dead. And he said this. He gave a list of diabolical beliefs and practices that have been wrongly attributed to Christians. These include, this is his opinion, he's a Gnostic, and he's looking at what has become of Gnosticism in his time. And when asked who rose from the dead, it's kind of a leading question. He said, these are the diabolical practices that are wrongly attributed to Christians, including drinking the blood of sacrificed children, worshiping, I don't know if I can say this, the private parts of priests, worshiping a man who suffered death as some criminal, as well as worshiping a wretched piece of wood. He says, these and similar indecencies we do not wish to hear. It is disgraceful to have to defend ourselves against such charges. When you attribute to us the worship of a criminal and his cross, you wander far from the truth. Indeed, Minucius condemns pagan literalists who choose a man for their worship, and Theophilus ridicules pagan literalists for believing that Hercules and Asclepius had actually come back from the dead. So these are pagan literalists who actually espoused a story that morphed into the Jesus myth and was given attribution as a real historical event later by the Roman Church. And let's see here. The earliest, I'm skipping something. The literalists tried to co-opt philosophical writers because they had no early Christian writers. They really didn't. And there was no historical Jesus. And here's something to think about. There were no disciples. They were all invented. And it's not that there weren't stories of 12 disciples. There certainly were. And they were allegories, which we are going to take apart completely and explain, not to attack, but to explain the symbolism. The earliest literalist was Justin Martyr around the year 150. So it's a long time after supposedly the crucifixion. Even he saw Christianity as a philosophy, not a religion. When he died, his pupil Tatian abandoned Justin's literalism, called it innovation, and equated Jesus' story with Greek myths, which actually is accurate. And he said, compare your own stories, talking to pagan readers, compare your own stories with our narratives, take a look at your own records, and accept us, early Christians, as merely on the grounds that we too tell stories. Saying, getting hiccups. Saying that basically out loud in writing for all to see that these stories that the Romans are putting together and calling an historical accuracy, they're just a retelling of these other stories. Okay. So the international Christian Gnosticism, what is it? It's not true that literalism surpassed Gnosticism in the number of people who followed it and its influence and popularity. I guess what we would call conventional early Christianity, literalism, it's all the word of God and it all really happened historically. Those people were not the majority for a very long time. Literalism was a minor group that it developed at the end of the 2nd century in Rome. By then, Gnosticism was international. There really was no Roman Catholicism in Egypt, for example. Gnosticism prevailed with philosophers like Valentinus, and then there's a whole list of other ones. I'll spare you the details. At the end of the 3rd century, Bishop Demetrius was the first hint of Roman Catholicism in Egypt. It had finally gotten there. Meanwhile, big Gnostic schools existed all over the Mediterranean. In Antioch, Edessa, which is in East Syria, there's a book by Marcion called The Chronicles of Edessa, which is a Gnostic work. Rome itself was full of different Gnostic schools, and they're different because they all are derived from Gnosticism from different sources. There's Jewish Gnosticism, pagan Gnosticism, there's Zoroastrian Gnosticism, and we could go on. Persia speaking of Zoroastrianism, brought forward the Marcionites. Tertullian, the emperor, he complained that Marcion's followers filled the whole universe. At the beginning of the 3rd century, the leader of Syria made Christian Gnosticism the official state cult of Syria. And the quote, all Asia was dominated by Gnosticism, comes from St. Paul. The epistle Polycarp laments that the great majority of Christians embrace the idea of Jesus not existing in the flesh. So whoever wrote that wasn't happy with it. Manichaeism, I hope I'm saying that right. Manichaeism, 3rd century Gnostic belief group. It spread from Spain to China for more than 1,000 years. How many of us even know much about it? I'm going to have to do a video. Manichaeism synthesized Gnosticism of many religions. Remember that Gnostics at the core share the same belief no matter what religion they belong to, which is the oneness of all, the return to a knowledge or gnosis of the shared consciousness of all, that we're not our bodies, we are a part of the great divine. So Manichaeism synthesized Gnosticism of many different religions to create a form of international spirituality that embraced all humanity. It taught that all religions are one and the same doctrine. It was honored as a successor to Buddha and Lao Tzu. The growth of Christian literalism. Over the 3rd century, literalism grew in the West. In the East, there was more Gnosticism. Gnosticism was too mystical for a lot of people. They really wanted something simple that they could take literally. And literalism spread. So as it grew, so did its attacks on all other Christian schools. So as more and more people decided to accept this story as the actual truth in a real live physical historical event, they started attacking anybody who disagreed. And the people they're attacking are the followers of the belief systems that have existed for a very, very long time. The Gnostics accused literalists of establishing an imitation church that did not teach the inner mysteries. Now, I can't remember from the first 2 videos because I'm still working on this book. There were the outer and the inner mysteries, and if you started on a journey of spiritual evolution, you start with the outer mysteries. So it's like reading a child Aesop's fables. They, it's like a fairy tale, and they take it on face value. And there may be a simple moral of the story to teach you to be a good person in some way. And those are the outer mysteries. The inner mysteries are when you have achieved an understanding that, you're not your body. There's much more to the nature of existence. You get to that point, then they start teaching you, you're a pneumatic initiate, and they start teaching you the inner mysteries of what the symbols really mean. So some, like Valentinus, they tried to go along to heal the rift. So they were trying to pour oil on troubled waters. You know, the literalists don't agree with us, the Gnostics, but let's try to make nice. Some, like Clement and Origen, tried to do both, to embrace the historical Jesus and to teach Platonic philosophy. Mithraism also grew in popularity. It came from Persia, I believe, with the Roman army to the west, to the empire. And there are actual still existing altars to Mithras inside Catholic churches in downtown Rome. It's really interesting. They're down in the basement. The church got built on top of the temple to Mithras. They prevailed for a very long time. This is a Persian mystery cult, and it became dominant in the Roman Empire. It was adopted by the Emperor Commodus, and the Jewish Jesus cult followed in its footsteps. And it was adopted by Constantine mid-3rd century. Yeah, but you know, Constantine waited until he was on his deathbed just to play it safe. You know, he converted. Christian literalists became the party line of a totalitarian state, and Christian literalism was enforced as a state religion. Let that be an object lesson for us all. Everything old is new again. Literalism and literalists defended an historical Jesus because how else could it grow? How else could the religion grow without an inspirational real-life leader? This is the same as Mithraism. Am I saying that right? Yeah, Mithraism. Feels like it should have another S in it. Mithraism. Well, it doesn't matter. It asserted itself, and it grew, and it became dominant. But there was no historical Mithras. Mithras was a god, a Persian god. But there were charismatic followers of the cult, like with literalist Christianity. The myth of Jesus relied in part on the myth of Mithras. It kind of took notes, you could say. Literalist Christians claimed that the devil created the Mithras story to confuse people by imitating Jesus before Jesus was born. Okay, now it's getting crazy. Christian literalists became very like pagan literalists in rituals. So even today, the pomp and circumstance of the Vatican is originally pagan. So they were the ones to start calling a priest father. And as the cult of Mithras also called the priest father. Even though Jesus in the Bible, listen, this, and keep in mind, you know, we talk about him like he was a real person. There's a very strong reason to believe that this was all allegorical, but attributed to him. He said, no man is the Father. The bishop's mitre, you know, that funny double peaked hat that they wear, it's from what's called a mithra. That's where the word mitre comes from. And the shepherd's staff that the Pope carries around and bishops often carry around, it's also from Mithraism. The Bishop of Rome was called the Pontifex Maximus, and this cracks me up. The Pontifex Maximus, it means the biggest high priest, and it was the head guy of the pagan religion. It was the chief high priest of the pagan Rome, and the Pontifex Maximus became the pontiff, meaning the Pope. Okay, now we're going to talk about the suppression of women. Literalist Christians embraced Old Testament patriarchy and monotheism. They suppressed the idea of the Christian goddess. In 431, in Ephesus, which was the original site of goddess worship in the pagan world, they replaced her. They had a little meeting and they replaced her with the image of Mary. They started calling Mary the Queen of Heaven. And they also called her, in the Greek, Theotokos, or Mother of God. For the original Gnostics, Mary was another name for Sophia, and Sophia was the goddess, the queen of the heavens. So we start out with this partner to the source, male and female, and they play complementary roles in spiritual evolution, which we will talk about. And Sophia, which means wisdom, is the feminine creative aspect. Another name for her was Mary. And all of these other Marys are taken from that. For the literalists, Mary was a real woman. She was the mother of Jesus. The literalists saw no equality of gender. They were interpreting the Genesis, the book of Genesis, literally. Women were not partners with men. They were evil descendants of Eve, and it was her fault that Jesus had to die. Augustine said, because of the sin of Eve, even the Son of God had to die. What does it matter whether it's a wife or a mother? It is Eve, the temptress, we must beware of in any woman. So women became second class. The Gospel of John is renamed. It's really the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. The Gnostics say it was written by the master, not clear how to pronounce this, Corinthus, at the end of the 1st century. But it was actually, they have eventually discovered historically, it was written by somebody called the beloved disciple, and they found elsewhere that Mary Magdalene was always the only one called the beloved disciple in many, many texts. So this gospel was modified to fit the male writer's misogyny, is what they're saying here. Talk about attacks on Gnosticism. The literalists projected their own exclusivity and arrogance on the Gnostics, who taught that all is one. While the literalists condemned all other beliefs and said we're the only one, they claimed supremacy. Literalists preached there was a war between God and the devil, but then they turned around and claimed that they weren't dualists. The Gnostics were dualists. They called the Gnostics world haters, but they're the ones who were always espousing a martyr's death. They also attacked pagan cults. They called them barbaric sacrifices, which is ironic given the fact that their main story is that God sacrificed his son. At the end of the 4th century, literalists went after all their rivals. There was an orgy of violence, literally an orgy of violence. They tore down pagan architectural wonders, which is really sad. They burned books because they rejected wisdom and science. This is like uncomfortably familiar, I think. They killed philosophers, priests, priestesses, and scientists, anyone who disagreed with them. They created the end of culture and they descended into a dark age. They tried very hard to kill mysticism, but it was occulted and saved. Religion that was left was offered as finding the afterlife, in in taking on blind belief and obedience. Christian leaders were power crazy. They're really into hierarchy, patriarchy, power. The state denied the right to autonomy, and it filtered into religion. Really worry about that. Gnosticism was suppressed, but it was never eradicated. It can't be because it comes spontaneously from the soul in a quest for truth, in the spirit of liberty, equality, love. It creates insight. It is a natural force of life, and it's always reasserts itself. We're getting very close to the whole idea of natural law here, enlightenment. We talk about Gnostic heritage. It survived, Gnosticism survived a little longer in the East, what became the Byzantine area. It still passed on oral secret teachings to those initiates into the inner mysteries. And part of that was the Bible is an allegory. It's a symbolic set of stories that teach a lesson in simple terms, not meant to be taken literally, not meant to be historical. And gnosis, wisdom, reveals the secrets. Mary is the manifestation of Sophia, wisdom. The goal of Christianity, Gnostic Christianity, is to become God. Well, that shook people up. Some mystical writings were smuggled to the West and were said to be by the pupil of Profus. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And he was the last pagan Gnostic master from the Platonic Academy. So, Plotus was the last existing student of his. The academy had been closed by Justinian in 529 after more than 1,000 years of continuous teaching historically. Probably older, but and the Gnostics were the first Christians. Dionysius, the writer, said that Jesus was not historical. He was a symbol of logos. He claimed two gospels, one that was familiar with church teaching and the other that was secret, symbolic, and required initiation and should not be divulged to the uninitiated. There's no point in telling somebody who doesn't understand what they're hearing. They will misunderstand and react negatively. Christian symbols have different meanings to initiates than they do to just superficial people, meaning uninitiated. Don't suppose that the outward form of these contrived symbols exists for their own sake. It's a protective clothing which prevents the common multitude from understanding the ineffable and the invisible. Only real lovers of holiness know how to stop the workings of the childish imagination regarding the sacred symbols. And don't take them literally. These are children's stories hiding deeper meaning. They alone have the simplicity of mind and receptive power of contemplation to cross over to the simple, marvelous, transcendent truth that the symbols represent. Oh, I forgot. I have a book that this book talks about, The Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius. I was going to bring it up and show it to you, but try to remember for next time. The Gnostics also were recorded. Gnosticism was discussed at great length in this book, The Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius. He languished in prison for heresy for teaching Gnosticism. And during his time in prison, he said that Sophia visited him and taught him deeper meanings of the philosophy. Christian literalists embraced his work. He never mentions Jesus. He only mentions Sophia. So it's weird that his work survived. I mean, I actually was taught it in school, not too in depth. But I have the book and I know I read it and I recognize it. That's all I can tell you. Let's not get crazy. But the fact that his book was allowed to continue is interesting because he never mentions Jesus. But he was tortured and killed by the Christian emperor Theodoric for heresy. Theodoric was called tolerant of the Roman Catholic Church, Roman Christian Church. And I wrote in the parentheses here, histories written by the winners, because when you look this stuff up, Boethius is discussed as a heretic who was executed for his heresies against Christianity. And Theodoric, who killed him, is called tolerant. Okay, so the early Roman Church tried everything to suppress the heretical Gnostics, mostly because the Gnostics didn't want any part of their hierarchy and their control and their authority. Well, there was a lot to it, though. The Paulician Gnostics, the ones who followed Paul, survived into the 15th century as the Bogomils, the Friends of God. And Bogomil was a traditional Pythagorean name. I have done a video a while back, maybe a year ago, on the Cathars, who were kind of a breakaway group of them, who were completely wiped out in a crusade. They had their own Gnostic pope. Uh-oh. In 1211, the anti-Bogomil Council called their belief unholy mysteries like the Hellenic pagan rites. Well, true enough. They were from the pagan Gnostics. Of them, the literalists said, they denounce wealth. They have a horror of the czar. They ridicule their superiors. They condemn the nobles. They forbid all slaves to obey their masters. So the Bogomils developed into Cathars, which means the purified ones. So the Friends of God evolved into the purified ones. And this was the main form of Christianity in France, Spain, and Italy. We're talking the 1200s, 1300s. They condemned the literalists. They called them the Church of the Antichrist. The Cathars claimed to be the inheritors of original Christianity. This did not go down well in the Vatican. Like the original Christians, the Cathars were vegetarians. They believed in reincarnation. They considered the Old Testament God Jehovah to be a tyrant. The Pistis Sophia, an early Christian gospel, explains that Christ taught through the mouth of our brother Paul. The Cathars, now Christ not being a person, Christ meaning the anointed one, consciousness. The Cathars maintained this tradition, claiming that Jesus was not ever in this world except spiritually in the body of Paul. The Cathars were respected for their goodness, even by their opponents. And here's a famous little tidbit which will probably sound familiar. The Catholic Bernard of Clairvaux writes, if you interrogate them, no one could be more Christian. As to their conversation, nothing can be less reprehensible. And what they speak, they prove by deeds. As for the morals of the heretics, they cheat no one, they oppress no one, they strike no one. And yet, the Inquisition was created to wipe them out. In 1139, Pope Innocent III said, and this guy was not innocent, declared that anyone who attempted to construe a personal view of God which conflicted with church dogma must be burned without pity. In 1208, he offered indulgences and eternal salvation, as well as the lands and property taken from the heretics, to anyone who would take up the crusade against the Cathars. This launched a brutal 30-year pogrom, which decimated southern France. 12,000 people were killed at Saint-Nazaire and 10,000 at Toulouse, to give two examples. When asking the main inquisitor, Bernard Gouy, I can't pronounce it properly, how will we know who's Cathar and who isn't? How will we know who's guilty and who isn't? Because he said, don't spare any of them, no matter the age or gender. His answer was, kill them all, for God will know his own. And it's been misquoted as kill them all and God will sort them out, but that's where that comes from. They were fleeing to Bosnia, where they were still thriving, as if it were the promised land with the bogomils. Cathars, converts to Roman Catholicism, had to wear a yellow cross on their clothes. Does this sound familiar? It should. They had no civil rights. They burned them in ovens in the East. But their fate inspired the German master Eckhart, who lived 1260 to 1328. And he wrote of Sophia, the divine spark, and the Christian, Judaic, and pagan belief all in one, which inspired many mystics and groups. Direct descendants of Eckhart, German master Eckhart, are the Quakers, the Diggers, the Ranters, okay, and the Levelers. This group, these descendants of the Cathars, inspired Dante. And if you think about Dante's Inferno, the circles of hell, it's symbolic of the Gnostic circle, where gnosis is at the center, the radius is your journey to the center, the circumference is the suffering of the physical world. The circle represents suffering, and there were many different circles of hell in the Inferno. I was so thrilled when I read this the other day. They inspired Leonardo, Michelangelo, Pico, who was a 23-year-old writer, and many philosophers of different academies. They inspired Blake, Milton, Goethe, Galileo, Copernicus, Kepler, Descartes, Hegel, Jung, who said the Gnostics were psychologists, that mental illness was failed initiation. And this stuff that he talked about was not even published until after he died. This is Jung we're talking about. All my life I've been working and studying to find these things, and these people knew them already. In his 40s, using a pseudonym, the name of the 2nd century Christian Gnostic Basilides, however it's pronounced, Jung wrote his own Gnostic scripture called 7 Sermons to the Dead. This remarkable text is addressed to the disquieted dead who had been failed by Christian literalism and who appear to Jung wailing, "We have come back from Jerusalem, where we have not found what we sought." Jung regarded this work as the wellspring of all his later insights, but he prohibited its publication until his death, fearing it would discredit him in the eyes of the scientific establishment. He was asked, "Do you believe God exists?" And his response was, this is on TV, he said, "I don't need to believe. I know." What is the literalist legacy? How much more of this? Okay, I'm going to end here because this is a very long section and I don't want to split it up. So this is the end of video number 3. And we'll move on to number 4. If you're still with me, I hope somebody is. I would appreciate, I'm going to do a little plug here. I've noticed that there have been fewer people following the books. And I know that there's a core of really devoted people that contact me all the time and for various reasons look forward to these books, no matter what they are, and thank me for doing them. And it's what keeps me going, because it's disheartening to see that so few people really pay attention to them. I pick them for a reason. Not that I'm any authority, but I find them interesting. And I would appreciate it if anyone listening right now would just sort of spread the word, because these books deserve more attention than they're getting. And I'm basing that opinion on how few people watch. Maybe it's me. Maybe people are looking at the name of the book and going out and buying the book and just ignoring the synopsis. And that's good. I mean, I would rather that happened than that the book goes completely unnoticed. So having said that, make sure that you're subscribed. Thank you. And I'll be back. Slán go fóill. Sláinte.